workshop looking at exegesis. This workshop this year is a little different than what we've done in the past for obvious reasons. COVID prohibiting gatherings. One of our biggest events at the Writing Center is our Exegesis pizza party, where we bring all of the TAs together and all of our students together, and we just have pizza and break up in different tables and talk about Old Testament exegesis, New Testament exegesis. But unfortunately, that prohibits us. Our current situations prohibit us from doing that. But nonetheless, exegesis is still an assignment that everybody has to create and do. So we wanted to go ahead and offer some resources for that. You'll notice that I've phrased this title of this workshop as practical tips for exegesis, because the other thing that's happened during the pandemic is that professors are reorienting how they do assignments and what they expect from students. And so not everybody is writing a full exegesis paper in this semester. Some are doing exegetical worksheets, some are doing like small exegetical assignments. So I wanted to capture that in the process of exegesis. So we're going to be talking more about how do you get into the mindset of thinking about exegesis and framing a reading of a text, and less about the actual structure of a paper, because that varies from class to class. If you have specific questions about paper and writing, by all means come and see us at the Writing Center, or just send me an email personally, zane.mcgee@emory.edu, and I'm happy to talk about the specifics of those with you. So to start with our session, let me pull up my slides. Okay, and now this never works the way it's supposed to. I've lost all my Zoom controls now. Bear with me. Oh, there's no pressure like the pressure of trying to solve a technology issue while people are waiting on you. All right, we'll try this backwards. I'll share my screen and then launch the. All right, can y'all give me a thumbs up if you can see the PowerPoint? Perfect. Thank you for your patience with that. So I want us to start just by asking you the question of what is exegesis for you? What do you think when you hear the term exegesis? What's the first thing that comes to mind for you as you think through this?
Breaking down the text.
Okay, say that first part again.
Breaking down the text. That's the first thing that comes to my mind.
Good. Yeah, breaking down the text. Good. And what do you mean by breaking it down?
Taking it apart, looking at the words, looking at trying to figure out what those words mean in context. Also, what really kind of stands out to me, and then doing more research to figure out what that text means. So
good. Perfect. Perfect. All right, others, what does exegesis mean to you?
Getting something out of the text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's kind of the classic example we see, that when professors talk about exegesis versus eisegesis, right? The difference between reading something out of the text. The ek in Greek means out of, right? So we get the English word exit that begins with ek, so it means to do something out of, whereas eis means to put something into. And so that's the kind of the classic distinction that professors tend to make. Exegesis is approaching the text and seeing what I can draw directly out of the text, and the accusation of eisegesis is that you're putting yourself into the text. We'll look at that claim later in the class, but that's the basis of it. Good. Any other observations? Yes.
Zane, you might want to move your video because it's right in front of the PowerPoint. You might want to move it like to the
Oh,
right or
sorry.
yeah. Yeah, I see it. Okay.
Thank you. I forgot that my screen is sharing the whole screen and not PowerPoint. All right, good. Any other thoughts on exegesis? Okay, so here's a quote that I am very fond of, and if you ever hear me speak about exegesis, this is one of the quotes that I often come back to and use over and over. And this is from Carl Holliday, who is now Professor Emeritus of Emory, retired 2 years ago from the New Testament department here at Emory and Candler. And something he would say in every class that I took with him that had some sort of exegetical function to it is that exegesis is the art of seeing. And so that's a very simple quotation, but what it means, as I understand it, is that exegesis is simply the art of being able to sit with a text and look at a text and to see what it is that the text is saying. So what that means is that exegesis is not necessarily the art of interpretation. Interpretation does play a part in it, and we'll discuss some of that today. But exegesis is primarily the art and the skill of observing, of paying attention to the text, of paying attention to the pieces of the text. And then from that, you're able to create an exegetical paper. Something that often gets confused in exegesis for students is the process of exegesis and the exegetical paper. And so it's important to think about that the exegetical paper is the product of your exegesis, but it's not the exegesis itself, if that makes sense. And we're going to talk a little bit in an example that I'll give here in the future about the idea of art versus the tools used to create art. And some of that's the same as this distinction that we could make here. That before you start writing an exegesis paper, you should already have done the actual exegesis. You should have actually understood what it is that you think you see in the text. And then the paper is just your way of trying to present what you already know about the text to a reader so that they can share your understanding of it. So that's what I see as the simplest form of discussing what is exegesis. Now, exegesis has 3 steps to it. Well, I mean, it could be broken down into any amount of steps, but I want to emphasize 3 of these steps. And these, I'm going to move quickly through these because I want to get to the promised practical tips of exegesis, which all have to do with these kind of 3 principles of exegesis. The first, as I mentioned, is observing. Exegesis is about observation. It's about sitting with a text, being able to see what words are repeated, what phrases are repeated, what thoughts are expressed in different ways, but are still connected. So it's about just sitting and observing and seeing what's in front of you. The second part is, I don't love this phrase, and I tried to think of others, but on a pinch, this is what I've settled with, is sanitizing. But some alternative phrases might be decontaminization or refreshing. But essentially, the idea that I want to put across here is that part of exegesis is being willing to remove the conclusions that you've already made about the text in order to approach the text again. So in that sense, it's sanitizing in that I'm not approaching the text as a neutral reader who has no opinions and I'm like a pure scientist who can just observe, right? That is a view that people have had of reading the New Testament in the past. Our modern critique of those approaches is that nobody is a neutral reader. All of us have something that we bring to the text and to our reading. So we're not trying to remove ourselves completely and become this like neutral, abstract, scientific observer. But what we are trying to do is be aware of the things that I approach the text with. And that includes not just like my personal feelings or my personal identity or my cultural presuppositions and all of those things, but it also, for us in the context of a theology school, also means our theological readings that we come to the text with. Most of us at this point, I would presume, we can say that all of us have some understanding of Scripture. Right? We don't have the fullest understanding of Scripture, but there's probably not many scriptures we could pull out of the New Testament that you wouldn't be able to say, yes, I have heard this talked about. I know the general idea of this. And so part of this sanitizing process is just finding a way to step back for a moment from all of those things, not to throw them away and say they're invalid and I'm never returning to them, or they have to be put aside, but for a moment to step outside of those and say, if I approach the text without those things in mind already, what does the text actually say? What does the text actually indicate for me? So that's what I mean by sanitizing our approach to the text. And then the third is just the fact of the act of drawing connections. Every text, every author repeats words, they repeat phrases. Sometimes it's unintentional and it can actually give us a glimpse into the subconscious of what is important to that person. But a lot of times, especially in written works that people know are going to be read by other people, published written works, those repetitions are intentional. An author wants you to pick up on these ideas, wants you to pay attention to them. And what they said 2 chapters ago with this same word, and now they're saying it now, and then in 2 chapters later, they use it again. That repetition is meant to build some type of theme. And so part of exegesis is also not only observing the text, but it's also making connections within the text. So as I observe, as I see these things, what kind of plot points can I begin to make in this text? I think of it kind of like constellations, right? If you've ever looked at star maps and star constellations, if you look at just the outlines of constellations and how they're made and what they are, you would have no idea. Like you can look at this and say like, what that's not a bear, that's not a scorpion, like literally it's 3 lines, right? But somewhere in an imaginative mind, those 3 points connected and they were able to form a scorpion, or they were able to form a bear. And so that's where these things get their meaning from. So that's something to think about as far as how we connect dots, and then we give meaning to those dots as we talk through and think about exegesis. So let's look then at a couple practical tips for exegesis as we move along. I'm going to pause for just 1 second because somebody has joined our other chat room and I want to get them in the right room. Okay. So this is a quote from Gordon Fee, who's a New Testament scholar. And I'll read this for you so you can, but you can read along with me on the screen as well. And this addresses the idea of the sanitizing of our approach, right? The decontamination of what we bring to the text. So Gordon Fee says this: whether one likes it or not, every reader is at the same time an interpreter. That is, that most of us assume as we read that we are also understanding what we read. We also tend to think that our understanding is the same thing as the Holy Spirit's or the human author's intent. However, we invariably bring to the text all that we are, with all of our experiences, culture, and prior understanding of words and ideas. Sometimes what we bring to the text, unintentionally to be sure, leads us astray or else causes us to read all kinds of foreign ideas into the text. So this is Gordon Fee's observation that, as I said, that nobody is a neutral reader of the text. In the past, the idea has been that to approach the text with my own experience as negative, we are moving towards a more healthy view of recognizing that human experience informs the interpretation of a New Testament text. But we have to also recognize that our human experience is not the human experience of the early church. It's not the human experience of the people who wrote these letters. So before I make that step of bringing my experience to the text, it's important to pay attention to what I think that the authors and the readers of this letter would have thought and would have paid attention to. And then I think we have space to move to the text and to begin to think about how our experience informs the text. But that doesn't technically fall under the umbrella of exegesis. And so I only make that distinction because when a professor asks for an exegesis paper, they're primarily asking for you to pay attention to the original author, the original environment, and the original readers, and to kind of, as we said, draw out of the text the meaning and purpose in that. So let me pause for just a second and see if there's any questions thus far. And then I want to move to 6 practical tips that I have for exegesis. Any questions? Let me check our chat. Okay, yes, Crane, the recordings will be posted. I will post this and I'll send a link as well. Okay, so let's look at some practical tips for exegesis. As I mentioned, this is not practical tips for writing an exegesis paper. This is practical tips for doing the exegesis that gives you the material that you then turn into an exegetical paper. So tip number 1 is just that exegesis takes time. This is the number 1 tip that I would recommend for you. And every professor says this about papers, right? Papers in general is don't start writing your paper a week before it's due. That's true as the director of the Writing Center. I'm going to reaffirm you should start writing much earlier than the week before your papers. But I'm not, with this tip, I'm not interested in your writing. I'm interested in just the fact of engaging with a passage takes time. And so here's my tips of what I mean of this taking time, is that my practical tips would be for you on a piece of paper to print off your passage and the surrounding verses. That can be as big as you would like, but I would probably recommend the 5 verses above and the 5 verses after, and then whatever cluster they're in. So don't just pull out 5 verses if it's a 6-verse cluster, right? You want to keep it with its context. But print off that passage in its immediate context. And then what I would recommend is that daily, you read through that passage for weeks, right? In an ideal world, that's what I would like to see. If you're working on New Testament and your paper is due, your first exegetical exercise is due tomorrow, then you don't have weeks to read through these passages, right? But if you're in OT, I know for a fact that you do have weeks at this point. So you can begin reading, if you're not already, begin reading daily through your passage. Now, if you think about it, it would take you less than 10 minutes a day to read through your passage. If you print it off and you just read through it verse for verse, don't speed read, because your point's not just to read it and check off that I read it for the day. The point is to begin observing things about the text. But if you could do less than 10 minutes a day reading these verses, what's going to begin to happen is you're going to begin to see things in the text that you didn't realize were there. You're going to begin to see things in the text that appear out of nowhere, right? Because they're things that you wouldn't have seen if you were just rushing through the text. I wish that I remembered the book where I read this, but it was in my undergrad, so it was years and years ago, but it was a book on exegesis. And the author used the example of a student who was a marine biologist and is studying a certain species of fish. And his professor asks him to write a full report on everything that he knows about the fish. And the student brings the report, presents it to him, and the teacher says, you know, you've done great work, but this is not sufficient. There's more that you need to know about this fish that you need to tell me. So he goes back, or she goes back and studies and writes and produces this paper that's even more thorough than the first one, and submits it. And the professor says, again, you've done a great job, but there's more that you should know here. You haven't covered everything. So they go back and they do it again and again, and this repeats 3 or 4 times. And by the end of this process, the student has filled this paper with all of these observations about the fish that originally they didn't have. And when they go back to the professor for the last time and say, here's the report that I've made, have I finally covered everything that I need to know about the fish? The professor says that the first report was sufficient, but I wanted to push you to think about what you didn't see the first time and what was still there to see that you haven't seen. And so the repeated exercise of going back over and over and over and forcing yourself to look for things that you don't see is the part of what the time process of exegesis is that in reading this passage every day for weeks and weeks, my encouragement to you would be to try to make one new observation every reading. So every day, just one observation. It doesn't have to be groundbreaking. It doesn't have to revolutionize New Testament interpretation, right? All it has to be is one new, the emphasis is on new, one new observation about the text that you didn't know before. And by the end of a week, if you've done this for 3 weeks, you would have 21 observations about the text. Now, you're not going to, when you go to writing, you're not going to put those 21 observations into a paper, right? You're going to create a thesis statement. You're going to structure those observations around your thesis, but it's helpful information that you have. The two last things on thinking about exegesis taking time. The fourth is that I would recommend that you avoid the low-hanging fruit. And what I mean by that is the obvious interpretations of the passage. With exegesis, generally what your professors are wanting to see is that you are diving into the depths of this passage. So to use the fish analogy again, a professor wouldn't be, a marine biology professor wouldn't be happy if a student submitted a paper that said this fish lives in the salt water, eats, plankton, and is bright red and has 2 fins on its side, right? That tells us nothing helpful about the fish. And so by the same means, I would recommend that you avoid the low-hanging fruit of interpretation, that when you read a passage that's about Jesus healing a child, your exegesis of the passage should be more than, in this passage, Jesus heals a child and performs a miracle, so we know that he's the Son of God, right? That's the surface reading of this text. That all of that is true, but that's not the level of engagement that your professor's wanting. And we'll get to some of the questions that will take you beyond kind of that low-hanging fruit. And then the very last one is my suggestion, and I think this is missing in a lot of students because they feel so much pressure to be academic, to be quote unquote intelligent, to be quote unquote smart, that I would just encourage you to think freely, right? Allow yourself over these weeks of reading to be creative and to think about what the text means, and think about, if this story was told differently, what might it look like? If the story was told in a different context, what might it look like? Those won't be the basis for your exegetical paper, but when you have time, you can think freely, because time relieves the pressure, right? And it allows you to be a creative individual. When you don't have time and you just have to get 12 pages typed by a certain time, then you don't have time to think freely and think creatively. You're just plowing through this paper. So give yourself time so that it allows you to relieve pressure and to think creatively. All right, tip number 2, ask the text questions. At its heart, this is what exegesis is it's you as a reader asking the text questions and trying to get the text to answer those questions for you. And what I mean by get the text to answer those questions, I recently in an assignment wrote in the instructions on an exegetical assignment that you should ask questions about the text, and you should think about how the text, I think I said that you should only ask questions that can be answered of the text. And a student responded and said, if the text can answer the questions, then why am I asking them? All right, that's a valid question. But what I mean by this is, before we go to commentaries, before I say, what does this professor say or this researcher say, or before I go to theological books or dogmatics or to philosophy, before I go to any of that stuff to understand what this text is saying, let's try to let the text tell us what it's saying first, okay? So we're asking questions of the text that tell us specifically about this incident that's going on. So again, to use the example of Jesus healing a young child, if we read that passage and it nowhere mentions in that passage sin, like the healing of the blind man, where the question's raised, who has sinned, this man or his parents? If we're in a different passage that doesn't bring that up, it may not be the best place for us to start with that passage to ask, what is the relationship in the New Testament between disability and sin, right? Because that particular passage isn't addressing that question. It's a valid question, and this passage may apply to that. But for us to begin our process of asking questions that the text can answer, we would instead want to look at what's in this text itself that can answer. And then for bigger projects, we can expand outwards. So for me, the number one question of any exegesis project is why. If you can just start asking your passage why, then that means you're no longer assuming that the passage makes sense to you. Because you have to remember, you're reading a passage that was written at least 2,000 years ago, written in a different culture than yours, written in a different language than yours, and written to a different people than the culture than the culture that you belong to. So all of those things would suggest to us that this text that we're reading shouldn't make as much sense to us as we think it does, right? An example I always use, we won't go into it now, but an example I like to use is to post a passage from Shakespeare and to ask students to read this passage and tell me if they understand it. And most of them don't, right? And if they do, that we understand a little bit of it, but we don't understand a lot. But Shakespeare's written in English. It's written in a Western culture, which is similar to ours. It's written a lot chronologically closer to us than the New Testament, but yet we have a really hard time understanding Shakespeare. If we have that hard of a time understanding Shakespeare, how much more difficult should it be for us to understand the New Testament texts? And so to ask the question why is to kind of restore that unfamiliarity. It's to assume that I don't already know the answer. So some of the questions is why here? Why is this story being told at this point and not at another point? Why did this author not choose to tell this story 2 chapters earlier or 2 chapters later? Why is it put specifically here? Why is it this story that's being told? Why isn't another story from Jesus's life just as important or helpful? Why is it not? So if we say why this, right? Why this story? Then the question might be why not that story? If we know of other stories, why isn't that author telling this story here instead of the story they're telling? Why is the author telling the story in this way? When you get into the Gospels, this becomes a particularly helpful question. Why is Luke telling the same story that Matthew's telling, but they're telling it in different ways? You can ask, why does the passage start here? Why is this where the story that I'm hearing begins? And then also, why does it stop here? How many biblical passages have you read or narratives in the Bible have you read that you're left at the end like thinking like, where's the sequel, right? Like I want to, like we've had this character, this big event's happened, this miracle has occurred, and then we don't ever hear from this character again, right? Why does the story stop there? So asking these questions about why causes, it helps us to kind of open up our understanding of the text and approach the text with kind of a fresh perspective. Along those lines, I'm not going to go through every question word, I promise. Along those lines, though, is that what is a close second to the most important question you should be asking of a text. Why and what, I think, are the 2 most important questions. So ask, what does this word mean? This is one of the biggest, is that if we hear theological terms like righteousness and salvation and faith and love, we assume already in our heads that those words have meaning to us. But is the meaning that those words have to us the same meaning that they had to the original audience? And I think that's what the question of what is that we need to step back and think, what does this word actually mean? If we were to, and if you don't have Greek, if you don't know Greek, there are plenty of resources for English speakers to be able to look up words and to see their original meanings, either in Greek or Hebrew. So your original language skills shouldn't limit you in this. In the same way, we can ask, what does this phrase mean, right? What does the righteousness of God mean? That's a phrase that Paul likes to use. What does the faith of Christ or the faith in Christ? That's what we're discussing in my Galatians course now. What does that phrase specifically mean? What does the phrase Son of God mean in the Gospels? So those questions are not only about specific words, but also about phrases and clusters of words. Along the what, we can ask, what does the audience understand here? What might the original audience have thought about this story? What is the logic here? Why is this passage put here? What's the logic that connects the pieces of this passage to each other? And then an important question is, what does this accomplish? Right? Every New Testament writing, every biblical writing, you can tell I'm focused in the New Testament. You can apply all of my examples to the Old Testament if I fail to make that connection. Every biblical story is a story that has been specifically chosen to be recorded. So the question is, what does this accomplish? Why is this story being chosen and being told to the generations of people that come after them in order to accomplish something? The author wanted to accomplish something when they chose that story, right? So what is it that was hoped to be accomplished with this? So those are some of the what questions. Also, don't forget, you can ask any of the interrogative questions, right? Who, when, where, and then how. All of those are helpful things to ask of the text as well. But start with the why and the what, and don't forget to ask those questions. All right, the rest of our tips are a little bit, we can move through them a little bit quicker. So my third tip is to have dialogue with people and with yourself. Dialogue with yourself and speaking to yourself sounds a little crazy, but let's be honest, a lot of the things that we do in seminary, especially right now, are a little bit crazy. So it's not that far off, right? But have dialogue with yourself. My suggestions for this is a tool that I personally use and that I like to recommend students use, and that's just writing paraphrases. If you write a paraphrase of your passage, it forces you to not repeat what the author's saying, but for you to start making sense of the passage yourself. And something you might do if you're reading your passage every day for several weeks is every 3 or 4 days, you might stop and write a new paraphrase, and then try it again in 3 or 4 days, and try it again in 3 or 4 days. And that would help you mentally track how your understanding of this passage is changing. Another favorite tool of mine is whiteboards. And I prefer actual physical whiteboards. You can go into, especially now if you're on campus, there are plenty of empty classrooms with empty whiteboards, although I guess you aren't probably supposed to be in them, but don't tell them I gave this suggestion. This is just between us, right? But I prefer an actual physical whiteboard. But if you don't have it, you can use a tablet, you can use a piece of paper, and just sit down and start scribbling, right? Scribbling this word, this character, this phrase, this event, and then try to figure out how do these things connect. I think having a physical representation of a story helps me kind of think about how they all connect together. And then the last one is just rambling. I know that this, on the craziness scale, this one goes towards the most crazy, but when you're driving to, assuming you're by yourself, if you're driving to school, if you're at a moment where you're in the shower by yourself, where you can talk, anywhere where you can speak out loud and think about things, I would encourage you to shut off your radio, shut off your podcast, and just talk through this story out loud to yourself. Say, if I was explaining this to someone, if I was teaching a class on this, this is what I would tell people about this passage. And I think that helps you kind of think about verbally out loud how these pieces can connect together. And then rambling puts you close to the next step, which is have conversations with other people, right? If you have somebody in your life who is generous enough to let you present your idea of your reading to them, then do that, right? Don't give an hour lecture, just have a 5-minute conversation with them and say, this is the passage I'm reading and this is what I've observed about it. And you'll be surprised that your observations spark observations in them that then spark observations in you. And it's a cycle that helps enrich your exegesis. Along those lines, ask for feedback. So ask people that you trust for feedback on your project. Ask them to give you feedback on your ideas and your methods. And then, what goes around comes around. And so be willing and free to discuss someone else's research and passage, because you'd be surprised. I've been surprised by how many times my research has been advanced by having a conversation with somebody about a passage that's not even related to what I'm studying. But because I see the approach they're taking, I see the method they're using, I see something creative that they're doing, and it sparks in me an idea of, hey, maybe I could take this and adapt it and put it and work with my passage in this way, right? So it's not always conversations that seem like they would be directly related to your exegesis that end up sparking creativity. And then the last, let's assume that you don't have anybody in your life who wants to sit around and talk about exegesis with you, which is a fair assumption for some of us. My wife is tired of hearing about exegesis for the past several years. So if all else fails, come to the Writing Center, because at a minimum, we pay our tutors to sit and listen to you talk about exegesis. So you can schedule a 30-minute session. You don't have to have a paper written. You don't have to have anything on paper. You can schedule a 30-minute session. You can come in and say, here's my project I'm working on, here's what I've concluded so far, and I would like to talk about it with you. And that tutor will sit and provide you feedback and listen to your ideas. So engage in dialogue with people as you're working on this project. Our fourth one, and I think this is a place where a lot of students get hung up on exegesis, is that they think of exegesis as a set of tools and not about understanding the text. So seek understanding, don't seek out tools, okay? Concordances, interlinear translations, parallel translations, Bible dictionaries, Bible software, all of those things are tools. They're invaluable tools for exegesis, but they aren't exegesis, okay? So a proper research tool will not make or break your exegesis paper. Well, let me say it will not make your exegesis paper, okay? So you're not going to just pick up a concordance and look up where the word faith occurs and copy and paste all of those into an exegesis paper and have an exegesis paper, right? It's about what you create with those tools. So I use here the example of saying that a cabinet is not a hammer, right? We use a hammer, but we use the hammer to create something else, to create a cabinet. In the same way, art is not paint. We take paint, we put it on a canvas, and nobody walks into a gallery and goes, man, I love this paint. This is great color, right? We love the art that is created by the paint. So when we use research tools do not answer the questions for us. We ask the questions, we find the answers. Research tools help us do that, but we can't rely on them. And so I emphasize here that you are the person that asks the questions of the text. And whatever questions you come to the text with, that's going to determine the answers that come out of the text for you. Now, just so nobody mishears me, tip number 5 is, but do go ahead and seek out tools, right? So research tools will not make your paper, is what I said earlier, but poor research tools will break it, okay? So again, to return to our analogy, my son recently was either trying to be independent or was just tired of waiting on me to help assemble this thing that we had bought. And so he decided to do it himself. And he was putting it together, and it had screws that were included in the package, and he couldn't get it together, and he had a hammer, and he was hammering the screws, trying to get the screws into the thing, right? But that's not how they work, right? A hammer is not a screwdriver. And in the process of using the wrong tool, he ended up damaging the thing that he was making. He ended up damaging the screws, right? It caused a lot more harm than by using the improper tool than it would have to use the proper tool to begin with. So I say that because in exegesis, especially when we are all overloaded with work and readings and projects that we're doing, and now in the COVID era, when we're not physically on campus, it's very tempting to just find whatever free resources are available, to go to biblehub.com.org and type in, our passage and read a free commentary that's on there with free word definitions, and to build our exegesis off of those. If you were in a world where that's the only resources you have, I would never disparage them. But you are not in that world. You are in the world of being a student at Candler who has access to Pitts, and Pitts has made a tremendous effort to make valuable and responsible research available to you electronically for free. So don't rely on free resources, because typically free resources means that those resources are so old that they're out of copyright. And if they're out of copyright, that means that nobody cared to renew the copyright to begin with. So those resources are free for a reason, and that probably means that they're not the most accurate and up-to-date tools for engaging your research. And then also, while you're engaging tools and using tools, commentaries I know are an invaluable tool for research, and they're a tool that everybody goes to. But try to read different perspectives within either the commentary tradition or outside of the commentary tradition. If you are a Methodist, try to read non-Methodist readings. If you're Lutheran, try to read non-Lutheran readings, right? Try to read what other people are saying about this text so that it challenges you to think about the presuppositions that you have. And then on the tip for finding valuable research and using proper research, talk with Pitts. Pitts has, as I said, they've made tremendous efforts to make resources available, but they also make tremendous resources for their librarians to be available. So send them a message if you have questions. If you don't know how to access a free resource on the Old Testament, send them an email, send them a message through their website, and somebody will point you towards electronic documents that you can use for free. And then March 24th on Wednesday at noon, I've included a shortened link here, but you can also go to pitts.emory.edu/WW for Wednesday workshops. On March 24th, Wednesday at noon, Brady is going to be holding a workshop on exegesis. And Brady, unlike myself, is a scholar in Old Testament. So for all of you who are working in Old Testament, he will have the tools and the knowledge to direct you where to find resources specifically oriented towards the Old Testament. So our project, our workshop has been oriented on the task of thinking about exegesis and how to process through a text. Pitts's workshop will be emphasizing the resources that they have available and how you can use the tools to back up your own research and readings. And then lastly, my sixth tip, as you should expect, is to visit the Writing Center. Okay. Oh, this copy and pasted my text from the previous slide. Sorry. So ignore those bullet points. Visit the Writing Center. As I mentioned, all of our tutors are available to have conversations with you about exegesis at any stage. If you're writing a paper, we're happy to talk about your draft and your final draft. If you're working on an exegetical worksheet, we're happy to read through your responses for each section. If you're just beginning and you have just handwritten notes on a piece of paper about what you think a passage is saying, we're happy to talk with you about that and to begin to structure an organization of a paper or a thesis around the observations that you've made. So don't miss the valuable resource that the Writing Center is. All of our meetings are online, so you don't have to be on campus at all. We'll meet with you electronically wherever you're at. And we also have tutors available now that we're meeting virtually. We have tutors available in the evenings as well. So if you are busy during the day and don't have time to meet with us during your regular hours, then we're there for you in the evenings as well. So don't hesitate to reach out to the Writing Center also. All right, I'm going to conclude there on our tips on exegesis. If you have questions or comments, I would welcome those, but I want to be sure and end because I know some people will have responsibilities at 1 o'clock. So if you need to leave, you're free to do that. If you would like to ask questions, I would like to hear those as well. So I'll open the floor to you all.